When it comes to towing, seeing is believing. That's why Chevy Truck's advanced camera technology offers up to 8 available cameras for 14 unique views, so you can focus on the view that really matters. Chevrolet, together let's drive. Learn more about Chevy Trucks at Chevy.com. Safety or driver assistance features are no substitute for the driver's responsibility to operate the vehicle in a safe manner. Read the Vehicle Owner's Manual for important feature limitations and information.
Being a marketer's no sweat. You just have to manage dozens of channels, launch hundreds of campaigns, score thousands of leads, and okay, fine, it's a lot of sweat. Unless you have HubSpot's AI-powered marketing tools to help you do all that and more. Get started at HubSpot.com/marketers.
Hello, welcome to another edition of the Ducks Confidential Podcast. I'm James Crepea, joined as always by Ryan Clarke, and we'll be going over, obviously, what was the game of the year for Oregon and Ohio State on what was a weekend that was billed as the biggest weekend of the college football season, certainly the regular season. The weekend lived up to it, as there were just a extremely high number of really competitive games. And this one most certainly topping the list, entering the weekend, and then the way that it ended and the way that it played out, it lived up to it in every way. So a weekend that was enormous, and for those who had the ability to watch many of the game at one time, a great viewing and fan experience. And for those who got to take part in this one, particularly at Autzen Stadium, a fantastic atmosphere, one that you would order up by way of the environment, and then the way that the crowd obviously performed all night, leading to 4 false start penalties for Ohio State, as well as delay game. Obviously had a huge impact on the game itself. And then with the game, the way the game ended, quite the celebratory scene at Autzen Stadium for the signature win of the Dan Lanning era, and one of the biggest, at least regular season wins, if just not wins in general, in Oregon program history. So we'll get into all of that and a lot more of the details and whatnot of the game. Don't think we'll be talking a whole heck of a lot about the short week ahead for Purdue. That's not really going to be much of a focus for this week. So going into this one, Ryan, to start off with, 32-31, and again, the way the game ends, where seven lead changes. We saw some quirky plays. We saw some unusual moments. We saw plenty of missed opportunities, certainly for Oregon, with the missed PAT, the missed field goal, the failed 2-point conversion, the 4th down stop inside the red zone. And yet, Oregon outgains, outrushes, has the takeaway, has the onside kick, and manages to win and pull off an upset despite those things, where if not for coming through, if not for myriad deep shots against a defense that had not allowed them, and if not for, frankly, just being the more physical and better coached team all night, any number of those missed opportunities, if it's a loss, we're looking back on and rattling off all the things that Oregon failed at and weren't able to accomplish. And that's why it was mainly self-inflicted, and that's why they lose the game. Well, they obviously show a ton of resilience along the way, on top of outplaying Ohio State. What are the biggest takeaways you've got, the biggest things that stand out on a night that had, like I say, it's fair, more than its fair share of not just moments, but plays on both sides, really, that stand out in a game that had a lot of them?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many layers to this one. You said it. One of the biggest wins in program history. Incredible environment. I think that anybody that has been around sports in this state over the last couple of decades would say one of the better sports environments that they've been in, perhaps in their lives, and for many people, definitely in the last 2 decades. So, the awesome time at Autzen Stadium. As somebody who grew up in this state with a lot of Duck fans around him, that was something special to be at that game, to witness what happened, to see the crowd storm the field after. But the game itself, I think it's Oregon proving its mettle among some of the national championship contenders throughout the country. That is as Dan Lanning was one of the first to point out. That is an elite Ohio State team, top to bottom, both sides of the ball. They were as advertised in this game, and Oregon played up to their level. This is an Oregon team that started the season off a little slow, that, people had their share of criticisms, many of which were fair, of how, sluggish Oregon was to start the season. But from the offensive line, turning things around and not allowing a sack and blocking so well for Jordan James in the run game, and doing as well as it did against this Ohio State front seven stands out. Dylan Gabriel remaining efficient, not throwing a pick against a vaunted Ohio State secondary. The wide receivers that at the start of the season claimed that they were the best wide receiver group in the country, delivering an excellent performance going head to head with that secondary, and then obviously playing on the same field as another of the best wide receiver groups in the country. All of that was, I think, terrific from the Oregon offense. And then the defense, obviously, it was for much of the game, a bend, don't break situation against one of the most talented skill groups in the country. And save for a couple of big plays, including that, Travion Henderson 55-yard run, and, the big playability of those receivers, I think the Oregon defense held serve when it needed to. And obviously, end of the game, the defense is out there and they get the stop necessary to pull off the upset win over the Buckeyes. This Oregon team is on Ohio State's level. And regardless of what happens this back half of the season, which, Oregon should be favored in all of those games for the remainder of the season, they have put themselves in the driver's seat to be in that Big Ten championship game and perhaps play Ohio State again come December for round 2 of what could even, with the new playoff, be a 3-round sort of battle between those teams. So we'll see how the rest of the season plays out. But this game in particular was something that showcased, I think, what Oregon fans were hoping for coming into the season, what the hype built towards with this Oregon team, and that they are built with the experience and talent and, frankly, coaching necessary to contend on a national level. And this was the proof.
It's hard to say how much validation one gets or is supposed to get, or what that even means, quite frankly, in regular season games now with the expanded playoff. But it was there was a lot of validation there for all of the questions that were there on both sides entering this game, because this was not unusual by any stretch. But both teams, both programs, it could have been said easily for the first month and a half of the season of, well, we're really not going to know much until that game. Well, they're going to be 5-0, but how much do we really know? And that was true both ways. Yeah, Ohio State had been more dominant, albeit against its schedule, which included 3 MAC teams, and obviously a rebuilding Michigan State, and obviously a fairly middling Iowa program that's not going to be in the top. It's probably going to be contending to be in the top half of the Big Ten. And you didn't know exactly everything that they were bringing to the table, other than a whole lot of talent. You didn't know exactly, they're the number 1 defense. Well, how valid was it? How real was that? They got a lot of talent. They're putting up the numbers, but they didn't play a quarterback who could test them. They didn't play receivers who could really stretch their secondary. So, that's good, but how real was it? All their rush defense is number 3. Well, again, but how many offensive lines did they play who could really go toe-to-toe with their defensive front? And on the other side, of course, for Oregon's purposes, it was, the O-line got off to a terrible start, but then these past 3 games, things are looking better. But had they really turned a corner, or was it that Oregon State and UCLA, who basically don't generate any pressure whatsoever, that you're taking advantage of and getting some statistics against teams who have no ability to generate pressure whatsoever in their defensive fronts? And, that receiving core, at moments, certainly Tez Johnson had his moments earlier, but can they really come together? How are they going to fare against a better defense? all those sorts of things. And in virtually every single one of those questions that one could have logically and fairly posed of either team entering this game, Oregon got the positive answer and the validating answer and display and performance. And Ohio State is the one turning around and has to look and go, oh, are we a paper tiger? And I realize this is in a 32-31 football game that could have just as easily ended with a different result. But even in a win, there would have been questions about Ohio State's defense when it allows its most yards since the 2022 CFP semifinal in the Peach Bowl to Georgia, that allows a 100-yard rusher for the first time all season, and I'm not even sure how many they had last season, that allows Evan Stewart to go off for not just 100-yard receiving performance, which, again, first also since that Peach Bowl in Georgia, and for the most yards by an opposing receiver since a few games earlier in that same season. So for all of this talent, and obviously both teams are loaded, and both teams have big NIL budgets and all those sorts of things, there were still going to be all those questions about some of Ohio State's performance and statistics and achievements to date, even in a win. In a loss, yeah, even more so. There are not as many of those, oh, wait a minute, kind of questions to pose for this Oregon team. Did they allow some yards? Yeah. The Ohio State offense is the best offense they're going to play all season. So allowing 400-something yards is hardly the issue. Quite frankly, a lot of them were sort of empty calories. That's not to take away, but just calling it what it is, 467 yards, and Smith gets 100 exactly on the nose, and Igbuka gets 93. If you take off the 38-yard pass to Smith, which was an awfully nice throw, and two, a nice route by him where, yeah, look, he ran a crossing route where, credit to the freshman, he had Jabbar Muhammad on him, got some space, made a nice catch. There's a little bit of an underthrown ball, and if there's even a tenth of a second more, Muhammad might be able to completely turn around enough to be able to make a play on the ball, but okay, there you go. But otherwise, 8 catches for 62 yards to Jeremiah Smith. There is not a defensive coordinator in America who wouldn't take that. Are you kidding?
Yeah, a game like this, against playmakers like that is less about the on the whole numbers, and more about like the moments and getting the stops in the key moments and limiting rather than like fully shutting down and containing, because you're not going to fully shut down and contain a guy like Jeremiah Smith. He's just too talented, already capable of potentially playing in the NFL when he's got 2 more years until he can go there. And other great players across their offense too. I mean, it's no small thing. And this was something that Dan Lanning pointed out in the post game, that they outrushed Ohio State, that they held Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins mostly in check in this game, save for that big couple of runs that Henderson had back to back. I mean, he picked up, out of their 100-something yards, he picked up like 72 of them on 2 plays, and the rest was fully contained. Second half, I think Ohio State had just under 30 yards rushing. That's an incredible achievement for a defense that, is largely comprised of guys that, haven't played together for any number of years. And one of those guys, of course, being Derek Harmon, who has just been a total disruptor and one of the best defensive linemen in the country this season. Ripping the ball out of Quinshon Judkins' hands, man. Like that is the kind of will and the kind of aggression and ability that this Oregon defense has, just in miniature in that play.
Without the 53-yard run by Henderson, which was obviously it's a huge play, but without that run, Ohio State averaged 2.75 yards per carry.
Yeah, that's incredible.
1.6 per carry on 12 carries in the second half. And these are the things that define how you're going to pull off a game like that, especially when you have an empty red zone trip and, again, the missed field goal early on and those sorts of things. That's how you do it. You do it by, again, the recipe for beating Ohio State is obviously very much proven now over the last several years. Outrush them, win the turnover battle. That's it. Now, I mean, easier said than done insofar as, there's plenty of inferior teams who have no chance on earth in accomplishing that. But for those who are legitimate and have a chance to compete at that level and have the horses and have the bodies inside to create the blocks and whatnot to even stand the test, yeah, that's what one does. And lo and behold, yeah, Oregon is the latest to do that to Ohio State, to outrush them, and which of course that's twofold. Yes, Jordan James had just as big a night. Whether he had a 50-yard run or not, he had just as big a night. He had the 115. Henderson and Judkins didn't combine for 115. So James has the best night on the ground. The team has the best night on the ground. And defensively, not just the outright ripping away of the football, but defensively, what Oregon's front seven did, particularly the defensive line did, and not just containing the run very, very nicely, but also generating some pressure. I realized that whether there was a sack or not, or the sack where it's attributed as a sack where Howard basically just has to eat it and falls down there late on the final drive, whatever. Ultimately, there was enough pressure, there was enough disruption. Both quarterbacks had to throw a couple balls away, but the ones that were more on Howard's side, there were a couple of plays where, heck, they had him at one point. There was one where they had him really dead to rights in the backfield, and he managed to evade pressure and flip the ball off to one of the running backs and turned what should have been a negative play for quite a loss into, I believe, a couple of yard gain. I can't remember if I believe he dumped it off to Henderson. It was either Henderson or Judkins, either way. But bottom line, they got more pressure on him than the other way around, even without Jordan Burch in the game. And the kind of performance that it is hard to look at many things other than the missed opportunities that were, and really nitpick, even in a win, what those things would be where you go, well, gosh, Oregon really didn't do this well. No, they did a lot of things well. Again, the 326 passing, there were so many empty calorie yards in there. Some of the biggest gains Ohio State hit all night were on passes to tight ends over the middle,
including one that was that should have been an interception.
Including one that was absolutely an interception that I have no idea why that play was not reviewed. But if not for the 38-yard pass to Smith, that would have been the longest play of the night, a 32-yard pass to a tight end over the middle that was actually intercepted. Having said that, again, any opposing defensive coordinator will gladly sign up for, Ohio State's going to hit 2, 3, 4, 5 passes over the middle of the tight ends. But you're relatively speaking going to hold Smith and Egbuka to, in terms of yards per catch or what have you, in relative check. Yeah, they both had touchdowns. Egbuka got free on one against his own, and Smith on the crosser that just kept going and going on a prolonged play by Howard. Those will happen. But if you're an opposing DC, you're saying, I'm going to give up 3 or 4 passes to tight ends. That's going to be the longest plays that I'm going to have to worry about. Okay, sounds good. Thank you. So the 326 in passing, again, I don't make that much of a thing. Obviously, the penalties mentioned before, that more than half of which were on either false start or the delay of game. The crowd was a big factor. Third down, Oregon ends up winning there. Yes, Ohio State had 2 fourth down conversions. One was, just a quarterback sneak pushing to the pile, hardly a massive to do, but be that as it may. And on a night where, even with some miscues, and the biggest things to me to nitpick are on the PAT and field goal misses. I'm curious. Perhaps we'll get some insight from Dan Lang. It's not the most pressing question, certainly after the game, but one that we might get this week I just don't know why you mess with the battery on field goal at all. It's not a matter of blaming misses or anything on any one person, but why even mess with it? Why was Luke Dunn holding at the beginning of the game? he can't get the ball down on the missed PAT, and then he still goes out there for the missed field goal. Now, the hold wasn't the issue on the field goal. It was just plain a miss by Sappington. But why was he the holder at all? Why even mess with that? In times in the past where Oregon has either alternated long snappers or holders, it's been in games where the game was already in hand. On the opening score, I was a little bit perplexed as to why Ross James wasn't just back there, because these are not things that you see like any other team do. There's no reason to why mess with it. You have a snapper, a holder, and a kicker. Why? All right, if you want to tell me you have a long range kicker, that's one thing. But why mess with that? That didn't quite make sense.
No, I agree, and I think that in retrospect, like if they lose that game, you point to those sort of moments as like the difference. But even with that being said, and with those those sort of special teams issues that they had, that direct onside kick straight into the chest of the Ohio State player, making up at least some of that ground on special teams.
So great play by Boyle.
It was phenomenal.
A great execution by Andrew Boyle, who's here for a reason. And that is one where I say, when it's about out coaching, if it was basically led into in the telecast where Noah Eagle says before the kickoff, let's see if they get tricky here. Now, I don't know if he actually just said that just because then after it happens, then Todd Blackledge doesn't acknowledge that. I don't know if they did it on purpose. Oh, really? So you're just as unprepared as Ohio State special teams coordinator, apparently.
Yeah, or maybe the Eagle family between Ian and Noah are just students of the game, as they are. But
it was so blatantly obvious. That's the thing that killed me, was going like, I'm watching real time going like, well, they're at the 50. They just passed on the penalty in order to make it at the 50 and came off the failed 2-point conversion. And they brought Boyle in at the 50.
Yep.
He kind of did this a few times 2 years ago when he was healthy. Like, if you're an opposing special teams coordinator playing Oregon, and you know that Boyle is now kicking again, which was not a surprise because he did it last week. You have one job during the course of the week to prepare. What does this guy do as a kicker other than kick long-range field goals? Oh, well, 2 years ago he had multiple onside kicks. Maybe we should, be ready for that. And instead, completely unprepared. And lo and behold, you give up that one. Just a wonderful kick by Andrew Boyle and great execution, and Sali Apaga falls on it. And a great job by Oregon in that moment. And yes, is it still a gutsy decision to a point? But as Dan Lanning said, really in quite a long response post-game and explaining, and if you miss him, it just turns into a scoop kick. So there's really not much of a downside to it. But nevertheless, when people were in real time criticizing if you're going to go for two there, and you're going to go for two there, take the penalty and knock it down to a 1.5-yard attempt on a 2-point conversion as opposed to. Yeah, but not when you're going to go for the onside. Not when you got that club in your bag.
Yeah.
And they turn around and do that. Again, that gutsy to a point, but ultimately still just smart strategy, well executed across the board by Oregon, and just a absolutely miserable job. Again, one where if you're the special teams coordinator, if you're Ryan Day and you're looking at your special teams coordinator, you're going, what do you do all week? What do you do? I mean, everybody's highly paid. What do you do? Because that is one that if you're on the opposition, if you see 98 as a kicker go on the field for Oregon in a kickoff situation, I do not know how in the world you are not prepared for an onside kick at this point. But
yeah, you should have a way to line up differently on that, just to avoid being in that line drive sort of range too. But there was another play as far as having a club in your bag and perhaps a little bit of gamesmanship that's gotten a lot of traction on Twitter for good reasons or not. But between Twitter and TikTok, people talking about with 10 seconds left, the 12-man penalty that Oregon took in that situation. People wondering, and who knows if this is true or not. Maybe somebody will ask Dan Lanning that tonight at his press conference weekly. Was it potentially, given the weirdness of the rule in that, time will run off on the free play, potentially intentional by Oregon to have 12 players on the field so that they put Ohio State in that quote unquote impossible situation with 6 seconds left, that they can't really get to field goal range? And it ended up working, obviously, with Howard sliding with a second left and time running out. Yeah,
it's either a absolutely 3D chess bit of genius by Dan Lanning and Tasha Foy and company, or a inadvertent and unintentional stroke of genius. Either way, it obviously comes through and delivers in spades, because as you watch the play unfurl, again from the telecast, so you're getting the angle you're getting, there is a late sub where one of the defensive linemen, I think it's Caldwell, comes off, and they do make a change there. But after that, you then see a defensive back come on the field. So on one hand, you could say, well, if it was deliberate, and again, we'll get it from Lanning later, so we'll see what he has to say on the matter.
And who knows if he will be honest about that either.
There's no reason not to be. You're not going to get fined about it. It's
sure,
the rules.
Sure.
You're not going to get fined, penalized, or anything else. And who's going to criticize him? Right now, he's being attributed and called a genius for it, so why not just take the credit even if it was unintentional?
No, I'm sure he'll take the being called a genius portion, but at the same time, maybe you don't want to be honest so that you don't sort of inspire the Big Ten to take a deeper look at the rule. I don't know, middle of the season.
They don't unilaterally get to change the rule. So unless Steve Shaw is going to rewrite the rule book in the middle of the season for something that could have existed in the entire history of football, oh well. But bottom line, again, whether it was a stroke of genius or somebody came on the field and lo and behold, because it wasn't from the jump. They didn't trot out there with 12 guys out of the timeout and say, we are absolutely doing this. The way it unfurled was such where you go, could it have been unintentional and just kind of happened? Yeah. If you're watching from before the play from the angle, you literally see the other defensive back. I honestly couldn't immediately identify. I think it was Dante Manning. I'm not 100%. He was on the field, but I don't know if he was the last one on in that moment. But bottom line, you see the defensive back come on where it was very clear nobody was coming off. But since they were coming out of a timeout, again, if it was so obvious, well, they're just doing 12 and this is it, they could have just come out with 12 the whole time. It was a later in the moment. It wasn't exactly like 10 seconds before the play. It wasn't even 5 seconds before the play.
Yeah, it allowed the play to get off so that it could be the free play and to tick those seconds down. But there's no way of predicting what they're going to do on this.
I would absolutely be able to predict what they're going to do, which is I see an extra. It's a numbers game. Bunch receivers to the right. They have more hats than me, and I'm not bothering to sit there when Will Howard counting to 12.
I'm for sure.
More bodies on the right side. I got Jeremiah Smith one-on-one on the left side. If it was by design, it is enticed to throw to Smith on the left side, which, given that he's matched up with Muhammad with a safety over the top, Oregon is going to take that 8 days a week. They are going to live and die with that matchup. So it's either you're throwing into numbers and you're going to hope for an incompletion or worse, and again, then it's just a free 5 yards anyway. Or you're going to live with the one-on-one on the other side of the field, and that's the way it's going to be. They throw to the left side. It's broken up. Again, 5 yards, who cares? That's where everybody's getting to the point of saying, well, either it was absolutely brilliant and a deliberate maneuver, or as they say, or if it was unintentional, it's just an absolute stroke of good fortune and genius that happens to work their way. But ultimately, you allow time to come off. It ends in an incompletion. And hey, then Will Howard does what we've seen several quarterbacks do now, which I get that everybody understands the premise. You're trying to gain the yards, get down, and call the timeout. Except with 6 seconds, you don't have the time to do it. You just don't. You do not have the time to do it. I get the thought process, but there has to be the recognition before the play that there's 6 seconds left. I cannot run.
Yeah, or if you do, you would have to have been closer at the start of the run because he had to get into range first and foremost, and he's not exactly, a burner. So, for him, people have talked about wanting him to get down earlier, but it would have made for a pretty dang long field goal, even for their talented kicker. So
and one could argue about whether or not what field goal range is in the first place, and I don't pretend to know for what Ohio State's kicker can do, but bottom line is, it would have been a 55-yard kick in the first place because they're at the 38. So if you say, well, that's too far, so how far do you got to get to? And not the point. Point being, 6 seconds left. The ball's got to get in the air. That's the end of the story. That's it. Because even if we're going to say, oh, well, crazy short yard, design quarterback run from the jump. Okay. So you're with 6 seconds left in the timeout, you're going to deliberately run 5 yards? Do you still have enough time to get there? You're rolling the dice there one way or the other the minute that you run the football, whether by choice or by design. This is not a rugby run into a pile of humanity, drop to a knee instantly, and you can get that done in 3 or 4 seconds. This is empty backfield. And you've got to manage to gain something and get down that quick. I'm not seeing it. With 6 seconds left, ball's got to get in the air. So ultimately, and to say nothing of the poor clock management 2 plays before, where they come out of the OPI and clock's running and looked like they didn't know the clock was going to be running. And that's, again, just poor coaching.
Yeah, Day has to take a timeout there, 100%.
Well, either you take the timeout and that's the last one you got, or you just say, get there and spike it, and then we'll figure it out. But you don't allow the clock to wind down. They went from 22 seconds down to, by the end of the next play, to 10. You don't allow that. So that's where you go. Those are the things you just go, this cannot be. These are the moments. These are the instances where, again, think of what you'd be saying if it went the other way. If the shoe were on the other foot. If Dylan Gabriel, the transfer veteran quarterback, did these things. Think of all the criticism you'd have as an Oregon fan about clock management and those things of landing a company. Think if it were Cristobal, what you'd be saying. You'd be losing your mind. Here, why? So why is Ryan Day or Chip Kelly or Will Howard infallible in those things? So the criticism that I'm sure I'm sure they're not. In Columbus, they're having
Columbus.
They've had quite a few days. Yes.
Yeah, they've had a few days on sports radio in Columbus. I'm sure of the last couple days.
Bottom line, look, are they still an unbelievably talented football team who probably will end up making it to the Big Ten championship game? You say probably because, look, was Autzen electric and fantastic? Yes, it was. Yes, it was. I personally think I've actually heard it louder in a couple of moments, but in terms of prolonged noise, particularly in the last, in the fourth quarter, it was real good. But I do think that both in the Washington game a couple of years ago and the Utah game had its moments back in 2022. But ultimately, regardless, where it measured or not is not the point. It was a terrific environment. But if you're Ohio State, you should be awfully concerned because you still have to go to Beaver Stadium. And if the noise on Saturday night was that disrupting, it's going to get easier? No. Particularly when Penn State is better than it has been, even in years where it's been the 10-win team that just couldn't get over the hump. And now they know that they control their own fate in a matchup in a couple of weeks that they're probably going to both win until then and put themselves in position accordingly to where that's one of the bigger games, obviously, that Ohio State has left, no kidding, but that Penn State has as well. That what an opportunity that it is for them. So while we can all point to and say, these are probably the two most talented teams, the two best teams and the ones that'll end up meeting in Indianapolis, and they very well could and might. With the way that Ohio State performed, both on the road and total lack of poise and composure in terms of pre-snap penalties, and then with some of these mental errors in particular, and being outcoached, I would not be an abundance of confidence just yet that they're going to get past Penn State this season. Because, like I say, those are the things that, from the Ohio State perspective, those are things they should be extremely concerned about with what they've got left in this season. Yeah, they've still got a really talented team. Yeah, they still have, very well might be the best wide receiving core in America. And Smith might actually be the best receiver in the country because he is awfully good. Even if he didn't go completely bananas in this game on Saturday night, he stat line was still nice, even if a lot of it was largely free access throws or shorter plays and the like. He's still awfully good. But my goodness, they don't quite chalk up everything for a rematch in Indy just yet. Because Ohio State's got some bigger tests down the road than Oregon does. As you say, Brian, Oregon's going to be favored in every single game from here on out, starting with this week at Purdue, and we are not getting into that matchup one iota. There is nothing to be said there. We're talking about the worst Power 4 team in the country. Yeah,
they have been terrible this season. Let's not mince words there, but
yes.
But that I guess it's a double-edged sword with the most recent game, the 50-49 loss, to Illinois in overtime. Yes, you competed with a team that has been one of the better teams in the Big Ten this season, but that also takes a lot of energy out of you ahead of a matchup against what I would argue is a significantly better team in Oregon on a short week. And that is going to be a major factor for Purdue. I think Oregon also, there's not much to preview out of this game, but I think for Oregon, avoiding this being a hangover game, an emotional hangover game from obviously you're so up for this Ohio State game. You don't want to mess around against a Purdue team that you absolutely should blow the doors off of. So go in there on Friday, take care of your business and get the heck out of there. I think that's their mindset. They're leaving a little later than usual for it. I think it's a business like, get in, get out approach from Lanning and company anyway. You learned a lot about yourself in the Ohio State game. You don't want to have any sort of regression. Alabama would be the first to tell you after what happened against Vandy. You don't want to have any type of regression against a lesser opponent in the following week after a prove-it game.
Purdue could put the drum in front of the locker room door supported by the Boilermaker special. And that would not be enough to prevent Oregon from dominating in this game. That there is no matchup to be had. There is no way. There's just simply no way. They are the worst Power 4 team in the country, and playing accordingly. Credit to them for not completely shipping it in and putting forth something by way of a competitive performance this past weekend. But
UCLA not worse?
There's just absolute no. Purdue is worse.
Okay.
Believe it or not, because UCLA actually has a couple of players. Purdue is worse. But alas, so like I say, we will not be getting into that one at any degree of length. In terms of other things that stand out from this specific game, I think showing the ability to take the top off against a defense that hadn't allowed it, and not just doing it one way and not just doing it with one player, doing it for different receivers, having 30-plus yard plays. I mean, that shows now a lot of them were directed at Denzel Burke. And there's something to be said for that, too, because Burke is their best cover corner. And for Denzel Burke to just get absolutely lit up on the 69-yarder by Evan Stewart, on the touchdown reception by Tez Johnson, he ended up being matched up, not, I don't think, pre-snap, but post-snap. He ended up being the focus on the 32-yarder to Terrence Ferguson on 4th down, which because the drive ends in the failed red zone situation, that play gets lost to the annals. That play in and of itself, it shouldn't be, because that's a 4th down at midfield, and Oregon's down in the game. Where if they don't convert there, if there's a drop, if it just sort of whatever, if something goes awry, Oregon is trailing in the football game in the third quarter, giving Ohio State the ball effectively at midfield, and oh boy. So yeah, the drive ends the way it does, but that play should not get lost to the stat book. That was a fairly enormous play, even if the drive didn't end in points. Because again, if it goes the other way, it's a 2-possession football game, and probably a 2-touchdown football game. So significant. But to hit 4 30-plus yard plays on a team that hadn't allowed one all season and allowed 10 all of last season, that to me was showing not just how good and deep and versatile and et cetera, this receiving core is and this offense can be. It shows that also up against the competition, and that a lot of those were air yards for a fan base that obsesses about that. Yeah, Terrence was a lot of yards after catch. Holden on his one catch that he had before blowing his top, it was yards after the catch. But Stewart and Johnson took the top off. And then you saw Stewart a couple other times also matched up with Burke on the touchdown reception. And both of them found holes in zones on some pretty nice plays, on third downs in particular. So I thought that it showed just the ability up against a very talented secondary, even if it was an overrated secondary in terms of statistically speaking, that this receiving core has the chops, that it wasn't all preseason hype, that they have the ability to go, again, toe-to-toe with anybody, and that they will be a problem and they will pose a test and a challenge. That it's not just, they're padding their stats against whoever. No, they're doing it, and they're capable of it, and this offense delivered in that way, again, with both yards after the catch and with air yards for big plays. And then also being able to, yes, find the holes in zones and takes those things too. Where again, if you're if you're looking at things on the other side, boy oh boy, you're saying, boy, well, so much for the number one defense. The minute that they play an elite team, it's chalk up 450 plus, nearly 500 plus yards, and how many plays are going deep.
Yeah, so much of the rest of their season is going to be about pushing back against that narrative, and they're not going to play, I think, an offense of the caliber of Oregon the rest of the year. But obviously that Penn State game is a good opportunity to show yourself. That should be a lower scoring, grind it out, classic Big Ten game, the way that both of those defenses have played this season, with the exception, obviously, of the Oregon game for Ohio State. But yeah, the rest of the year, with all the talent they have on that side of the ball, is going to be the sort of prove it, get back to what you think you are, and what you showed against, albeit lesser opponents, to start the season for Ohio State.
Yeah, and they've got a lot. Look, ultimately, no, that they play an opponent with all of the caliber of firepower and talent and mix of quarterback and receivers that Oregon has. No, they do not. But you do still have to play Nebraska. And yes, it's a freshman quarterback, but he can wing it. That's one. You have to go to Penn State. Are they the most talented by stretch at the receiver position specifically? No. But you do have to play one of your former receivers in Julian Fleming in Penn State. He's not going to be lacking for motivation, again, in a game where Penn State is probably the one who's going to be in the driver's seat in terms of determining its own fate. And then, by the way, and we've even remarked about them before over the course of the season, but credit where it is due. You are playing what is statistically a highly productive offense at Indiana. Now, I don't know. Again, talent, we're not getting into talent. I'm just talking about what they're putting up by way of points and production. Hard to criticize. Kurt Cignetti and company are doing something pretty special in Bloomington. Now, again, not to say that all of a sudden Indiana is going to actually knock off Ohio State, but Ohio State has to play those games. Oregon doesn't have those opponents. So, different kind of a situation. But again, that's their problem. For Oregon's purposes in terms of going forward, other than oversleeping their alarms on Friday night, quite frankly, issues to address, look at, fix, what have you, in terms of missed opportunities. To me, it starts with the red zone offense, which was already an issue before, mainly due to the interceptions, but other issues as well, because even without the interceptions the prior weeks, it wasn't like a absolutely abundance of tremendous execution if it weren't for just 1 and 2 yard runs. That has to get better, clearly. Starting there, because their touchdown percentage inside the red zone is tied for, I believe it was 73rd in the country right now. So that's got to be better, period. Second, hey, lo and behold, the issue that was talked about dating back to last December and all offseason long, and may or may not have actually been the reason why Poncho didn't get the starting job at center to start the season. Well, wouldn't you know it, that was real. In case you forgot what your eyes showed you back in the spring game, yeah, it's very real. There were 3 bad snaps in this game. And Oregon's fortunate that they didn't end up leading to calamity or turnovers. Gabriel wrangled 2 high snaps. And there was a low one as well, a dribbler along the ground. It's an issue. It's real. And that was at a home game. Forget about Purdue. Doing that at Michigan or Wisconsin in a tight game, or if you get to Indianapolis, where, in case you forgot, most of the Midwestern schools, we bit closer to Indy than the Oregon fan base will have to travel. Doing it in those settings, in a tight football game, where the crowd can and will be a factor in a 100,000 seat state, 110 nearly in the big house. A little bit of a different situation. So those, to me, are the things that jump off the page. To say nothing of, yes, the special teams, obviously, we for whatever reason, the kicking position and the consistency at the kicking position is just something that this program cannot get past. I cannot begin to explain.
Yeah, it's also sort of an obsession on the part of the fan base a little bit.
And it should be.
And it should be, for sure.
Because you don't see this in other places with this level of...
But hey,
on a constant basis.
2 game-winning kicks for Automaticus this year, even with the issues that that exist there. So
but be as it may, whether it's just sticking with one holder and keeping the battery unit together, whether it's consistency in terms of accuracy, whatever. Again, what do you do to improve a kicker other than all right, go out and make the kick? I mean, what great words of inspiration is one supposed? I mean, ultimately, that is the ultimate zero-sum position. Either you made it or you didn't. I mean, yeah. All right, if you want to tell me about the snap and the hole, that's another part of the operation. But in terms of the actual kick itself, I mean, what does one do? I mean, ultimately, it's good or it's not. So those, to me, are the 3 areas. Red zone offense as a whole, snaps, and the place-kicking game. I'll make it all-encompassing, because it's not just about one kicker, and it's not just about one moment. The place-kicking situation. The battery, the kicks themselves, the whatever. Those, to me, are 3 areas that you don't just say, well, those are areas to clean up and get better. No, like that's something that has to be all met with some degree of urgency. Because, yeah, again, it's there could be moments still the rest of this regular season, particularly with a couple of these road trips in November, where, and that's not to look past, by the way, the next home game with Illinois. Oregon's got 2 ranked opponents left. Depending on what happens in Michigan, Illinois this week, the loser's probably not going to be ranked. Shouldn't be. They're both in the 20s. So if Illinois is to win that game, well, that might be the toughest test Oregon's got left in the season. And even if Illinois loses to Michigan, it could still be the toughest test that Oregon has the rest of the season. That's not to look past that, but at least if it's home, you don't have to worry about crowd noise being an issue with the snaps, though it wasn't this week, but snaps are still an issue.
Yeah, and I think that Illinois defensive line is pretty dang solid too, despite giving up 49 freaking points to Purdue. I think that, the Illinois game in particular, after the high of Ohio State, after going on the road and taking care of business at Purdue, that's not going to be a cakewalk for Oregon. I think that, we'll find out the game time relatively soon. Speaking as a sports writer, would love to see a nice little afternoon kick, a nice little 12:30 Pacific time slot, but that is speaking completely in selfish terms. So,
well, believe it or not, CBS does broadcast games for this conference. It's not just rumor. Now, and it's not exclusively tied to USC either. I understand so far, one would logically come to that conclusion. Based on what we've seen so far. But believe it or not, CBS does broadcast football games for the Big Ten now. I know that you haven't seen it and experienced yet as an Oregon fan. That may be changing in the very near-term horizon. Whether it changes for the Illinois game, where you already knew there were like 3 different time slots, but you didn't know what network. One of them is 12:30. We'll find out shortly. But whether it's that or the Michigan game, something tells me that Nessler and Danielson may actually get an opportunity to call a game where Oregon is involved now. Again, I understand how and why it hasn't happened in a couple of instances so far. Look, on the Friday nights, it's not even an option. That's a given. But believe it or not, there may actually be those 12:30 games in terms of Pacific time because, lo and behold, CBS is now broadcasting for this conference. I know, again, it seems like an anomaly, and it certainly seems like it's been dedicated to USC thus far. But perhaps that might be changing in the not-too-distant future. As I say, otherwise, a terrific performance, obviously, a memorable one that you don't want to completely blow things out of proportion in real time, but you're also cognizant of the reality that in the totality of things and in the big picture of things, this was a program and a tenure for Dan Lanning that began with 49-3 against Georgia, and I don't think that those inside the program, in terms of the coaching staff, needed a reminder of what the gap looked like in real time at that time. But that's what the gap looked like between where they were and the elite. And now, 2.5 seasons later, you are one of them. And how they've gotten there, and has there been roster churn, and naturally there was natural roster churn by way of departures and graduations and NFL players and those things. Yes. But ultimately, the gap was significant. As good as Oregon was, and they were even still a 10-win team, but as good as they were not there. And last year, they were awfully close, but they weren't there. Now, they are with the elite. They are with Georgia and Bama and Texas and Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State and what have you. They are with, forget about blue bloods or anything else. Not every single one of those is blue bloods necessarily. They are with the elite. They are among them. They have proven it. They have the talent. They have the ability. They have the coaching. They have the home field advantage when it's a regular season game in those moments. And now they're in the driver's seat in terms of reaching the Big Ten championship. They have closed the gap. That, in the big picture, is enormous, obviously.
Yeah,
now,
it's proof positive.
What that could be in terms of the trajectory of the program going forward. There's still the rest of the season to go. We'll see. Yeah, and Lanning would be the first person to say that, obviously, as any coach would. A lot of football left, but it is massive. It is significant. I was there in Atlanta when sitting in the stands when Oregon got crushed by Georgia, and what Kirby Smart said about, having the players. Oregon has the players now. They've recruited phenomenally well. They've gone in the transfer portal in the new age of college football with NIL and everything else, and they've delivered, putting together a really talented, really experienced team. And this is the team
ultimately that, coming into the season with all the hype, all the expectations, the first year I think I can remember in Oregon football's history, even with the success of Marcus Mariota and those teams under Chip Kelly prior, the first year I can remember as somebody who's watched the entirety of this modern era of Oregon football, where they've come in with those expectations that they absolutely should contend for a national title. And despite the, flubs of the first couple of weeks, which in the end haven't ended up mattering all that much now that we've seen them play this elite Ohio State team, through all that, I think they have now arrived at this point where, yes, the expectation is being lived up to so far, and they want to continue to build on this and not backslide by any stretch of the imagination, and maintain their status as one of the teams capable of contending for a national title. And you want to put yourself in the best position possible for the new playoff, get yourself a bye, win this Big Ten championship in your first year in this conference, which is a talented and I think a little top heavy, but at the end of the day, a quality and power conference. It would prove so many things. It would establish Oregon in a way that, despite being one of the winningest programs of the last 2 decades in college football, in a way that they have not been before. And a lot of football left, long season left, but this is no doubt a moment for the history books for the Ducks.
One that can certainly be looked back on, if, again, depending on how the rest of the season goes, but ultimately one that can most certainly stand the test of time, without question, because of, look at your own program's history. You look back at the pick and what that set off. You look back at certain Rose Bowl trips, at certain quarterback tenures, at the playoff and beating Florida State, at what you take your pick. Select moments as moments of achievement and reaching certain plateaus and certain stages. Should Oregon reach some of those stages and beyond later this season, this is the kind of game that we'll look back on over the course of history as one of those defining moments. Should the season go the way it very well could. Could it also get lost to the history books to a point? It could. But realistically speaking, given the precedent that was, the biggest home game program history that was, and that it lived up to the billing in every way, again, one that will certainly stand the test of time in the short term, but what it could do and mean in the long term, that's for the rest of the season to determine. So again, much to discuss and look ahead to and focus on as the rest of the year does go on. But we will do that on a week-to-week basis, and you will hear from us next week after what should be an all-timer. Get your popcorn ready for Friday night for some TV viewing from West Lafayette, and enjoy that. And I say that for the rest of you. I will be there. I'm not sure very many other people will be. But there will be a few folks there.
First trip to the Midwest for the new Big Ten season. Here we go.
Yeah, what a coronation that'll be. But be that as it may, we will go over that one on Monday, and I imagine we'll be doing a lot of looking ahead to the matchup with Illinois, more so than looking back on a game from 3 days earlier that I imagine with a 4 touchdown point spread that we probably won't be talking a whole heck of a lot about. But like I said, I thought the same thing about Idaho, so you never know. Who knows? But yeah, as it may. In the meanwhile, folks can like, subscribe, 5-star review, all those fine things to help spread the word of the podcast, and that make sure that they're able to hear this podcast as well as many others on the Oregonian Sports Podcast channel accordingly. And they can fire away and send questions to Ryan accordingly for the weekly mailbag. Remind folks how to go about doing that, Ryan.
Yeah, so send me a tweet at Ryan T. Clarke or email me at rclarke, RCLARKE, at Oregonian.com. A little low on questions, surprised given the nature of Saturday's game. So if you are listening to this podcast and you've made it to the very end here, please send some questions. We have a lot to discuss from that Ohio State game and looking even beyond it.
And as I say, we will see you next week for another retrospective of sorts, and I imagine a little bit more of a preview next week. But be that as it may, we appreciate you, and we will chat with you next week.